Hi, everyone. My name is Rochelle Dalla, and I want to say that I am very grateful to be here and to be asked to present at the UNL Trafficking and Migration Conference in this virtual summit, and to be a member of such an esteemed group of individuals who will be sharing their work. The title of my presentation is Familial Sex Trafficking Among the Bidya Caste of India, Define the Dominant Human Trafficking Discourse. And I want to take a brief moment to recognize my colleagues, Caitlin Roselius, Victoria Johnson at the University of Nebraska, which is where I'm located, Jesse Peter, who is at Northwest Missouri State, Trupti Shivari Pashal, who is at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and then Ramni Rajan, Murlani Mishra, and Sagar Sahu, who work at Sambedna, which is the NGO that I partnered with for this research. And so today I'm going to be telling you about a little bit of my research in a very rural area of Bhopal. Bhopal is located basically in the central part of India. And so just a little bit of background. Sex trafficking is largely portrayed in the literature as an urban phenomenon. So a lot of research is looking at sex trafficking in larger city areas. However, and the thinking is that rural areas are source communities only, so that individuals migrate or are forced from rural areas into urban districts to participate in the commercial sex industry and largely trafficked into the urban areas to participate. However, in India, there is a thriving rural-based sex economy, and this is practiced by numerous Indian castes who engage in the commercial sex industry as a primary, and for many as an only source of income. In fact, it's estimated that there are over 100,000 women and girls at any point in time across India who are victims of customary caste-based prostitution. And one of these is the Bidya. So traditionally, the Bidya were a nomadic caste, and what they did is, for money, they were well known, well regarded for performance, and especially dance. And in fact, they are famous for a particular dance called the Rai dance. And it's considered auspicious even to this day to have Bidya perform the Rai dance at ceremonies, so religious ceremonies, weddings, that sort of thing. Well, with resettlement, the Bidya were forced to settle with British rule, and they lost then much of the income that was generated through traveling performances. And so as they settled, they began to rely on prostitution of female family members in order to make money. Agrawal, an individual who has studied the Bidya of northern India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, spent quite a bit of time, she's an anthropologist, spent time studying marriage patterns among the Bidya, and describes them as a very unique anthropological group. So one of the things she says that in contrast to the Indian son preference, the Bidya prefer female children. And she said this is a direct correlate to the need for women among the Bidya to participate in the sex economy to support the family. She also identified that female Bidya do all of the work. So they do all the familiar work, cooking, taking care of children, and they also do all of the breadwinning. So they engage in the sex trade to make income to support the family. So they do all of the work to maintain the household, but they retain very few rights. And so basically what happens with Bidya females is, as they reach early adolescence, they are selected by caregivers to enter either one of two different life paths. So one of them is to marry. And The other is to enter the commercial sex industry. So if you are a BDF female, these are the two trajectories that your life is going to take. For women who are chosen or selected to marry, they are the ones then that take care of the familial work, such as the cooking, the cleaning, and caring for children. These women never enter the commercial sex industry. On the other hand, other females are selected to be the income generators. And so they are selected to enter the commercial sex trade at about age 14 at maturation, and they are never allowed to formally marry. They are considered to be married to money, and that is their sole focus until they age out of the sex industry, meaning they can no longer earn money. The human trafficking literature that exists today, the bulk of this literature identifies risk factors for minors to be trafficked into the commercial sex industry. So the primary risks include poverty, running away, homelessness, out-of-home placement, risky migration, LGBTQ identification, abuse in the home, and substance use. So these are well-established risk factors for minor sex trafficking. Now, familial facilitated child sex trafficking has a couple of additional risk factors, including frequent relocation of the family and lack of child abuse detection. So families where there is abuse, but they're under the radar. So one of the questions for this research was really, to what extent are these risk factors, these known risk factors for minor sex trafficking, to what extent are these applicable to caste-based sex trafficking in India? The other piece of this research was also to look at the dominant discourse around sex trafficking victims and perpetrators. And what is discovered and what has basically been the major theme of the sex trafficking literature regarding victims and perpetrators is that it's very simplified, it's oversimplified. So as far back as 2002, Dozima described the paradigmatic image of the human trafficking, of the sex trafficking victim, as a young and naive innocent, lured or deceived into a life of lurid horror from which escape is nearly impossible. Nearly 2 decades later, we've seen very little change in the perception of who sex trafficking victims are. The ideal victim, and I put that in quotes because this is the misconception, but that individual is still to this day often thought to be an innocent, weak, vulnerable female who lacks agency or choice and whose escape from the industry is dependent on being rescued from other individuals. There is also misconceptions that are well known in the literature and highly disseminated about perpetrators as well, and who sex trafficking perpetrators are. So the ideal perpetrator, and again, misconceptions that continue to cloud judgment about sex trafficking perpetrators, are that these are middle-aged men, largely unknown to the victim, who deceive her into prostitution, or of evil, inhumane professional criminals who have total physical and psychological control over their victims. Now, there are implications for these images. First of all, having these misconceptions, they really challenge and impede identification of real victims and perpetrators. And they create challenges to effective responses to human trafficking. So they create challenges to really being on the forefront of preventing, intervening, and then prosecuting those who are perpetrators. The theoretical foundation of this research really rests in the social theory of intersectionality. And intersectionality really is focused on identifying multiple vulnerabilities that come together, the intersection of different identities, in this case, different vulnerabilities. So social vulnerabilities have a cumulative impact. They're not additive. So it's not like being a member of a caste that promotes children into the sex industry and being female and poverty. It's the intersection of all of these identities that create unique lived experiences for certain populations, and in this study, Bedia women in particular, and that have a cumulative influence on her vulnerability as a sex trafficking individual. So the research questions that guided this study was, first of all, what social and personal vulnerabilities put Bedia women at risk for sex trafficking? And how do these compare with the risks that are discussed and prominent in the human trafficking literature? The second question was, to what extent does Bedia sex trafficking reflect the dominant discourse that's prevalent, again, in the literature, with particular attention to the ideal victim and perpetrator conceptualizations? So the methods for this study is, this is a cooperative investigation between myself and members of Sambedna. Sambedna is an agency that's been in existence since about 2002. The headquarters of Sambedna are in Bhopal, which is in the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. Now, I worked with the Sambedna staff for about a year before data collection even started. And so in 2018, I went to Bhopal and met with the staff at the headquarters. We even went to several different Bedia villages just to sort of introduce me, to see how individuals reacted towards me. We did a lot of back and forth talking about what this research would look like, what questions would be asked, what would be the most effective way to conduct research with such a difficult to access population. And then a year later, I went back to Bhopal and stayed for an extended period of time, and then was escorted to various Bedia villages in order to conduct interviews. And so I ended up being able to conduct interviews with 31 Bedia females who were either in the sex industry or had recently exited the sex industry. These individuals were interviewed across 7 different villages, and there was targeted and snowball sampling. So before my arrival, even, the Sambedna staff went out and started talking to individuals, telling them a little bit about my research, seeing if they would be interested in being interviewed. And then when I returned, or when I arrived, we would go back to those same individuals. That I tell them a little bit more about the research, and they would discuss whether they wanted to be involved and talk to me or not. And then after interviews were over, there was the snowball sampling where they might suggest other people. Translation occurred in real time. So a Sambedna staff member went with me to all the interviews, was present in all the interviews. And so I would ask a question, she would translate, and then the participant would respond, and then the participant's response would be translated back to me. The shortest one was 20 minutes. It was basically ended because the individual was really, it was clear she was not comfortable. So we cut it short. The interviews on average lasted about 60 minutes. All interview questions were approved prior to by the Sambedna staff, and the study was approved by the Institutional Review Board at the University of Nebraska. All the data were then translated, transcribed, and analyzed using MaxQDA. So the 31 participants, they averaged 31.6 years. They ranged in age from 16 to 65. 13 participants had had 0 formal education. Among those that had had education, the number of formal education ranged from 2 to 8 years, with an average of 3.2. 17 participants were mothers. They had a total of 31 children, with 2.8 children each, and ranging from 1 to 8. In terms of age of entry into the commercial sex industry, on average, they entered at 14.8 years of age, but there was a range from 12 to 18 years. 26 of the 31 individuals were still involved in the commercial sex trade. 5 had exited out, and among those 5, exit happened on average at age 42. For others, or the range was anywhere from 36 to 50. So in terms of the goals of the investigation, the first, as a reminder, was to identify risk for entry into the commercial sex industry, and then to examine those risk factors in relation to the dominant human trafficking literature. And what was learned is that the literature that exists about human trafficking, and especially the commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking of children, is not reflective of the situation among the Bedia of India. For instance, none of the Bedia had been homeless. None had experienced out-of-home placement. None identified as LGBT or Q. None had engaged in risky migration. And in terms of substances, 10 of the participants reported that they did use alcohol, but this was a response to sex industry involvement, not a precursor. And I should note that all of the participants' names have been changed. I use pseudonyms here. So Avni reported, I used to drink a lot. I just drink and skip the breakfast and the lunch. And I asked her, why would you do this? And she said, because of tension of why we came into this line, meaning the industry. In fact, a couple of individuals reported that alcohol use or substances was really a liability to business. So Kiara said, we don't even touch it, alcohol. And I asked her, well, what if customers arrive and they're drunk? And she said, we would not entertain them to begin with. So then what really are the risk factors for entry into the commercial sex trade among this unique Indian caste? And there was really a trifecta. So obviously caste and family tradition, poverty, and gender. Only in terms of gender, only female BDA enter the sex trade and are largely the only ones who are even expected to generate income. So Romney, she explained the following. She said, my father had told me that I'll have to quit studies. And I said, I won't quit because I want to do some job. He said that we are poor people. We don't have much money. How will your brothers get married? Who will support the family? And Selena said, I have 2 daughters and a son. If the boy gets a job, I won't push my daughters into this profession. Otherwise, I'll have no other choice. So what's interesting is that she says, if the boy gets a job, not he will or he should or he's expected to, but it's really his choice. And if he chooses not to, well, then the girls have to go into the profession to support the family. What is interesting here, and which has not been described anywhere in the literature, is birth order. So prior to going into analyzing the data, one question that emerged was, well, it's probably the oldest daughter that then goes into the industry, or is it maybe the youngest? The thinking was that birth order had to play a significant role somehow. And I found that it really wasn't. In fact, in some families, it was the oldest daughter. In other families, it was the middle daughter. In others, it was the youngest. In some, it was a couple of different daughters who went into the sex industry. So what was discovered was that it was a convergence of being BDA, financial need or crises in line with female maturity. So it wasn't just one of these or another or the other or all of them. It was the convergence of the 3 that then determined whether and which female would be entered into the commercial sex trade to support the family. A second question of this research was really about the ideal victim and perpetrator paradigms in relation to the BDA. And one of the first things that we looked at or we examined was agency. And what we determined is that largely the BDA do not represent what is in the human trafficking literature, that their experiences are very different from the way that victims and perpetrators are portrayed in the literature. So in terms of agency, 8 of the participants indicated that they decided on their own to enter the commercial sex trade. And they did this with full knowledge of what their lives would be like. Sarasa said, I myself entered this line. And Badra similarly said, I had thought that if by ruining my life, I can make my family's life better, then what's the problem in ruining one life? Basically, for those who decided on their own, it's really important to think about agency within the broader context of the BDA. And the broader context is that there aren't other choices. It's not like these women are saying, well, I could do this to make money, or I could do this. Instead, it's my family has so much poverty and has no way to survive that I'm going to do this to help my family, or I'm going to do this so that my younger sister doesn't have to do it. So there's agency there, but it's important to really point out that agency is being initiated or acted upon in a context where there are no other choices. The second thing that was interesting in terms of agency was not just entry, but monetary control. So what was discovered is that when these young girls first enter the sex industry, the money that they earn goes directly to the family. But after they've been involved for a little bit of time, they themselves gain full control over the money made. And so Raya, who is 23, she entered the sex industry at age 17. And I asked her about the money and who it went to and who decided. And she said, I used to give the money to my mother. Now I keep it myself. Like today is Friday, so I will give father 500 rupees to get things. I decide how much to give and for which purpose. Romney had something similar to say. She was 20 at the time of the interview. She entered the trade at age 15. And when I asked her about money, she simply said, I keep. It's not clear at what point, though, women go from having no control over the money, making money, handing it over, to then being in control of that. They also demonstrated agency in exiting the sex industry. By expressing agency, they did this in terms of creating opportunities to exit early. And by early, I mean before they aged out, or to reduce the amount of time that they had to engage in the sex industry and see clients to earn money. So they demonstrated agency in exiting in a couple of different ways. One of them is in creating a love marriage. So remember that these women, BDA women, are not allowed to formally marry. However, it's very common for BDA women to enter into a love marriage with a man who has additional resources, who has supplemental income and enough to support a BDA woman on the side. And typically this happens from a girl who meets a client and the client really likes her and then wants to keep her on the side so that she isn't involved with any other man. He's got to have a substantial amount of income in order to do that, because he not only has to support her, he has to then support her family members as well that she's responsible for. But this is quite common. And typically these men are married, are formally married to other women, and they have children with them. And so in terms of this whole idea of love marriage, one of my participants said when I asked her about exiting, she said, well, I hope to fall in love with someone. He will pay for my expenses, and then I'll be able to get out. It's important to note, though, that just because these are called love marriages, it doesn't mean that love has to be involved at all, at least on the part of the female. And in fact, most of the individuals that I interviewed who were involved in a love marriage indicated that there was no love or emotion attached at all. The fact that these men had money and wanted to support them and their families, and that allowed them to exit, that's what the critical factor was. So Sarasa had been in a long-term love marriage with a man, approximately about 4 or 5 years. And I asked her about love, and she said, no love. He just gives money. The other way that the BDA women showed agency in exiting was by creating a business, devising, creating, building up a business with other girls who worked for them, so that they wouldn't have to see clients. Padma was an individual who was really very, very good at this and very smart in terms of how to generate income. And so she was 36, but she had really stopped seeing clients much earlier. She had a home in one of the villages that had the most traffic. That had the greatest access from other people to get to this village. And so what she did is she rented out rooms in her home to other girls who would come from more remote villages. They would stay with Padma, and then they would provide money to her for the different clients they would see. She would get a portion. And Kiera is one of the individuals I interviewed. She had done the same thing, but out of her aunt's home. So her aunt was making money. She stayed at her aunt's home, which allowed her greater access to clients. So Kiara herself could make more money, but then her aunt would receive 120 rupees from each client. There was another woman named Anju who was doing the exact same thing as Padma and Kiara's aunt. Now, I was not able to interview her. However, I did interview a girl who was familiar with Anju and who had worked out of Anju's home. And what Rhea said about Anju was, more customers come. Sometimes when 10 customers come, she, Anju, gets 1,000 rupees. And then she said, Anju is making good money. And I said, well, does Anju still see clients? And this participant said she is, but she has less customers. She said, there are many girls like me, meaning many girls who are working out of Anju's home, and Anju is then making a little bit of money from each of those clients that those girls sees. The final way that the women demonstrated agency was by grooming a replacement. And this is where we start to see these intergenerational processes really at work. So 12 of the women that I interviewed had actually been forced to enter or groomed to enter by a female family member who was working in the industry. So Salila, for instance, both her maternal and her paternal aunts worked in the industry. They groomed her to enter, and they exited the industry when Salila turned 16 and began working the industry. So then Salila was responsible for the family income and also for supporting her aunts who had been responsible for supporting her as a child and her siblings and her parents, etc. Ray Kin said something very similar. Her mother taught her the Rai dance when she was age 10 so that she could go perform the Rai dance, make money. And then later, when she was formally entered into the sex industry, her mother taught her how to negotiate to get money from clients. And what she said is, I wanted to get married, but my mother didn't allow it. She was also kept for dancing, meaning her parents or her mother had kept her for dancing and then entered her into the sex industry. She said, my mother and her sister were kept for dancing, and they were both in this profession. So it's very intergenerational. If you want to get out, you need to find a way to make money. And you either do it by finding an individual who can support you and your whole family, or by creating a business venture, having other people come, stay with you, stay out of your home, and then provide to you with income. Or as you start aging, you groom a replacement, and then they go into the industry and you exit. What this does, these different ways of exiting, and especially of grooming a replacement, really is where this line between victim and perpetrator erodes. Because these individuals who are then grooming their replacements, you could look at that from one angle and say, well, these are perpetrators. But on the other angle, yeah, and in a generation ago, they were victims. So it also, though, reveals personal agency on the part of these women in terms of exiting the industry and exiting before they are too old to generate any income. So in terms of looking at the vulnerabilities in relation to the first research question, what was discovered is that the vulnerabilities for minor sex trafficking among the Bedia caste and among many other castes like the Bedia, age, gender, caste, family tradition, and poverty and financial crises. And the greatest risk for a female entering the sex industry is at the point of intersection. Each of these alone is not indicative of someone or a key factor. It's the intersection of all of these that is the greatest risk for a female in a caste that practices prostitution or sex trafficking. What's Important to point out is that just age or just gender or even being a member of the BDA caste or family tradition do not necessitate that females are going to go into the sex industry unless these demographics converge with financial need. And this is very, very different than what is known about sex trafficking of minors in the human trafficking literature. The second thing that is also really important to point out is that the ideal victim-perpetrator paradigms or narratives that are in the current human trafficking literature are not supported when we start looking across countries and we start looking at other populations, very nuanced populations. And so what we see in terms of victims, that there is a tremendous amount of agency that is exhibited among these BDA females. They exert agency in ways that they have control over, in making a choice to enter so that their sisters don't have to, or because there's so much poverty, rather than being forced to do it, they say, okay, I will do this. They also demonstrated agency in various exit strategies and in controlling their own money. And in terms of perpetrators, we also don't see the same kind of narratives among the BDA that are presented in the human trafficking literature. So much of the literature really paints a picture of perpetrators as being very greedy and wanting personal gain and then using their money for various things, but not for sheer survival. That is something that was not seen among the BDA at all. What was seen was the need for families to find enough money to live above pure subsistence level. And again, I want to point out that the lines between victim and perpetrator can and often are blurred in very unique contexts. What this does then is it points out another really important aspect of doing, cross-cultural research with very unique populations. And that is in the way that we respond or think about interventions. So the typical response in the human trafficking literature is identify victims, rescue them, and then rehabilitate them somehow, and then prosecute the perpetrators. Identify the perpetrators, prosecute them. This mind frame is actually ludicrous if applied to the BDA or other castes that are also engaged in the commercial sex industry. Instead, what is really needed is to focus on the economic, social, and political vulnerabilities that limit opportunities for such populations and that create contexts for human trafficking and exploitation to thrive. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this research. And I can be reached through email if anybody has questions or wants to discuss this research further. Thank you.